So based on 2 years of research, over 150 interviews with current and former migrant workers and their families, Human Rights Watch has found in our report released today that migrant workers are facing widespread abuses in Saudi Arabia, some of which may amount to situations of forced labor. These abuses are occurring across employment sectors, across geographic regions, and including at high-profile so-called giga-projects like NEOM that are funded by or linked to Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, the Public Investment Fund.
Saudi Arabia did not come close to meeting FIFA's own human rights requirements through the bidding process. It didn't identify the risks. It didn't show how it would address them, and didn't show how it would host a World Cup that would not be tarnished by exploitation, by discrimination, and by repression. And I maybe just add to that and say that it's not just the flaws in the 2034 process. We see similar flaws for the process for the 2030 World Cup as well, in how weak some of the human rights strategies were for Morocco, Portugal, and Spain. The risks are slightly less severe, but they are significant on a range of issues there. But the process has been as flawed for that as well. We know this has been a predetermined outcome by the way that it was engineered for single bids from the start, the way there was no consultation, the way that there are no real minimum standards set out. But I think a real key piece of evidence is that when in the Saudi Arabia bid, when there was commissioned an independent human rights risk assessment of the Saudi Arabian bid, it was conducted by the Saudi Arabian branch of Clifford Chance, a law firm. In commissioning that bid, FIFA agreed with the Saudi Arabia Football Federation to limit the scope of that bid so that it didn't have to talk about LGBT rights, it didn't have to talk about forced evictions, it didn't have to talk about trade union rights, it didn't have to talk about freedom of expression. And it did that basically by saying, in violation of its own policies, that Saudi Arabia only needed to assess the human rights issues that Saudi Arabia had recognized in international treaties. And given that there are many, many human rights that Saudi Arabia has never recognized, it meant that some of the most severe risks of the World Cup were omitted. And that same omission was then came through in Saudi Arabia's human rights strategies. So for us to see that the Saudi Arabia was awarded a medium risk and that it got such a high score we described it as an astonishing whitewash, and that's what it is.
I think what's clear is they learned how to engineer the bid to minimize any criticism. Because again, if you take the weight of all of this knowledge, including that our report that we released today, I feel there's no way that that they should move forward with this host without ensuring that there is incredibly strong wholesale immediate reforms to the process. And I also want to note is I think the scope and scale of risk just based on the facts is also much bigger, right? There are about 2 million migrant workers in Qatar, a much smaller country. There are about 13.4 million migrant workers in Saudi Arabia. Many of them work in quite remote areas, right? NEOM is a project in the northwest of Saudi Arabia where migrant workers have often very limited access to embassies, to consulates, to urban centers where there are migrant support groups, where journalists have very little access.
Very possibly, I think the way that FIFA has set up the process has increased the cost for dissent, essentially. The fact that there is an unopposed process, I think, is the heart of many of the problems that we face. I think there's no incentive for the bidding countries to put human rights criteria, to take the human rights process seriously. There's no real suggestion that there's any alternative to the bids. And therefore, people might look at this and say, what's the point in speaking out? FIFA's human rights policies and the requirements in the human rights requirements bidding process have basically been a sham from start to finish. It's been an empty process that's really been there to serve a predetermined outcome. And FIFA will share responsibility of the real human consequences in that. We and others here have never been organizations who said that Saudi Arabia should not be allowed to host a World Cup. It should never be able to do so. It's basically been saying Saudi Arabia's got the right to bid for a World Cup like everyone else, but also needs to meet the human rights standards expected of other bidding countries as well.